want to welcome you to our 17th annual Adam Smith Week. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Peter Calcano. I'm professor of economics here at the College of Charleston and the director of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process. In front of you, scattered around on the seats, you'll see a QR code. You can scan that to give us both feedback, and we will capture your name and such for extra credit if you were so incentivized. The mission of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process is to advance the economic, political, and moral foundations of a free society. And we do this through a variety of programmings. We have our economics book colloquium, our free market speaker series, we support faculty research, and of course, Adam Smith Week. We have several events coming up this week. I wanted to take a second just to highlight. This evening, we're branching out over to the Citadel. So if you're willing to trek the 2 miles, right, a little north to the Citadel's campus, Dr. Ann Bradley will be presenting to us in the School of Business on Citadel's campus. Tomorrow night,
Are they not in order?
Apparently not. Or I'm clicking in the wrong direction.
Going in the wrong direction.
Yeah. It's all right. This is what editing is for.
Yeah.
Tomorrow night, we have Dr. Doug Irwin, who is probably one of the foremost authorities on trade and economic history in the U.S., is going to be talking about the current trade policies that you've, I'm sure, heard a good bit about. And on Thursday, we've got a panel of 3 wonderful scholars talking about women and economic freedom. The other thing that I want to highlight to you is this, that we've just launched a new minor in philosophy, politics, and economics that will start in the fall of 2025. And the center sort of acts as the extracurricular or sort of learning, experiential learning aspect of this. The events that we do are in context of this. I want to, of course, thank our sponsors. There are several of them throughout this week who have helped us. In particular for this event, I want to thank International Studies and the Moreau Institute. The last thing I want to mention is our Market Process Scholars Program. And that application process is open now. If you want to learn more about the Market Process Scholars Program, talk to myself. My colleague, Dr. Maldonado, is in the back. We have some of the scholars here. That application process is open until March 24th. And I would encourage you, if these events are of interest to you, to apply. With that, I'm going to introduce one of our Market Process Scholars, Lexi Red, to get us started on the program today.
Hey everyone, I'm Lexi Red. I'm a sophomore majoring in economics and international studies, and I have the pleasure of introducing to you today our wonderful speaker, Ms. Jennifer Murtazashvili. Dr. Murtazashvili is an extremely accomplished woman whose accolades and commitments are truly inspiring. She obtained undergraduate education at Georgetown University, earning degrees in foreign service and international politics. She then went on to the University of Wisconsin-Madison for her graduate studies, where she earned a master's degree in agricultural economics and later went on to earn a PhD in political science. Following her graduate studies, she served in assistant and associate professor roles at the University of Pittsburgh, where she currently serves as a professor at the university's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. She's also the school's founding director of the Center for Governance and Markets. She's won numerous awards for her significant contributions to the UPitt scholastic community, such as the Donald Goldstein Professor of the Year Award and the Chef Distinguished Faculty Award for International Achievement. Outside of the university, she also serves in numerous ways, such as a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a distinguished scholar of peace and international order at the Institute for Humane Studies, and a contributing editor at the National Interest magazine. She's also been notably recognized as one of the world's top thinkers by Prospect magazine. She's a member of the executive board of the American Institute for Afghanistan Studies, a board member at the Collins Institute for Abrahamic Heritage, and a member of PONAR's Eurasia. Her current research focuses on self-governance, security, political economy, and public sector reform with concentration on Eurasia, Central Asia, and South Asia. She's authored several books pertaining to her areas of interest, many of which have earned prestigious awards. All that to say, Dr. Murtazashvili is the epitome of a distinguished global scholar, and we are so blessed to have the opportunity to speak with her today. Would you all please join me in welcoming Dr. Murtazashvili?
You can give that to me.
Okay, perfect.
She pronounced my name better than I can. So, thank you very much for this very generous introduction. I just want to thank the whole team, Peter, your whole team here, Melinda, everyone at the center for just such a warm welcome, and to all of the students here. It's a real honor to be here. This is my first visit to Charleston. I got to tell you, I'm impressed. And you know, it used to be that Seinfeld, like students never heard of Seinfeld, but I think it's back in fashion, right? A little bit? Okay, so I'm a low talker, so if you cannot hear me in the back, just raise your hand and say, speak up, do not be shy. So I'm gonna tell some stories today, okay? I'm just gonna walk you through the topic of post-conflict reconstruction. And I know it's a topic that all of our politicians say is no longer in style. Every president comes to power and says, we're not going to do that state building thing anymore. They all say that, but within 2 weeks of coming to power, President Trump already had a casino in Gaza. So this issue of post-conflict reconstruction isn't going away. Why? Because as long as we've had people and humans, we will have war, for better or worse. And now after war, we have to think about how countries can rebuild. And because the world is smaller than it ever has been before, countries help each other. So I'm going to tell you some stories and share some of my experiences in different places in the world where I've worked, spent many years in Afghanistan. In fact, my first 2 books were on governance, how people govern themselves without the state in rural Afghanistan, based on many, many years of field work. And as the Republic, remember the Taliban came to power in 2021, you remember those sites at Kabul airport with those people chasing the airplanes? You know what I'm talking about? Okay. And so that was 2021 when the US withdrew from Afghanistan, the Taliban came back to power. And that has really led Afghanistan into a very dark place. And so, you know, I'm going to show you some tweets because that's where I spend my time trying to understand what's going on in the world when I can't travel. And so after the Taliban took over, Al Jazeera posted the story about what a hard time it is for women in Afghanistan. And I posted, you know, try to be hopeful, right? Today is not forever. So the situation with Afghanistan today for women is not forever. And of course, I got a nice response, because, you know, it's social media, everyone's really nice to each other. And well, I don't know if this is a person, it's a bot, whoever, says, look, next time the Afghans will take their destiny into their own hands and throw out the barbarians, maybe in 10 years, maybe in 40, people craving freedom will always win. So the implication here is that the Afghans didn't really crave freedom after all. They sort of got the government they deserved. So we can't get the sound to work on this, but these are some pictures that I want you to see. This is the moment that the Afghan Republic collapsed and the Taliban took over. Any thoughts about what you're seeing here? Take it in. You can't hear it, but. So you're seeing government soldiers hand over their weapons, their US-made weapons, their Humvees, you see, and handing it over to the Taliban. Surprise you?
No.
Doesn't surprise you? Anybody
No.
surprised by this?
No, honestly speaking, not surprised with how much equipment was left behind.
Okay.
There's a lot of equipment.
A lot of equipment, certainly. Trump's trying to get this back, right? Have you heard it?
Honestly speaking, I think we should have disabled a large part of equipment or brought it with us if we
We tried, right? It's a lot of equipment to get out. Anybody surprised by this? Yeah.
I'm not surprised at all. I mean, one of the reasons Biden lost was because of the Afghan withdrawal.
Sure.
We were there for 20 years, and instead of doing a normal withdrawal, he rushed it in order to get a photo op for 9/11.
Okay, what does this look like? Does this look rushed to you? Anybody surprised by this image? Surrender. This is the moment a country collapses. This is state collapse right here on YouTube for you to watch. Hundreds of Afghan soldiers are surrendering to the Taliban. Anyone surprised by this? Yeah.
Looks pretty calm and orderly.
Calm,
Yes.
orderly. Why is this surprising? What are the Taliban trying to achieve by this video?
Propaganda.
Why? Who are they trying to convince of what?
The people that they're in control, they're fully in control, that people support them.
People support them and
Legitimacy.
legitimacy. What else? What's it telling? Yeah.
Peaceful transfer of power.
Peaceful transfer of power. It's telling every young Afghan soldier, there are hundreds of thousands of them, surrender. We will not hurt you. A new day has come. Give us your weapons and you can go home. And that's what they're saying, which you can't hear in the audio. Give us your weapons, take off your uniform, go home. We're not going to kill you. We're not going to shoot you. There's will be no retribution against you. Because for years, these two parties were killing each other. Hundreds of thousands of people died during the 20 years of this conflict. Okay. So this is an image that scared me. This is a picture of, his name's Ismail Khan. He was the former governor of a province of Afghanistan. And prior to 2001, he was fighting the Taliban. Remember the Taliban were in power in the 1990s? Okay, so he was fighting the Taliban in the 1990s. The Taliban caught him, put him in jail. Then he escaped from a Taliban prison in 1995. And then he escaped and then joined the resistance. And then he joined the new government, the democratic government of the Republic of Afghanistan in 2001. He was a governor, then he was a minister. He was also a warlord governor, we called him, because, he came from the streets. He had his own legitimacy. So in 2021, when the Taliban were taking over, one of the last street fights was between this guy and the Taliban in the streets of Herat. And these were heroic pictures to many Afghans because they showed this elderly Ismail Khan with machine guns waiting for the Taliban to come. And when people had lost faith in their central government, they still had faith in Ismail Khan. And the Taliban captured him. I saw this picture. I said, he's done, right? He's an enemy, sworn enemy of the Taliban. They arrested him. He escaped. They caught him. I thought they were going to kill him. What did they do? They packed him up in an SUV, drove him to the border of Iran, said, get out of here. They let him go. These were really surprising pictures to see this peaceful transfer of power, the way that they dealt with Ismail Khan. So this question that, getting on Twitter, why didn't the Afghans fight? Why did they play dead for the Taliban?
Because they're tired of war. 20 years of war.
Okay, well, we'll see. Okay. So, the days after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, February 2022, Afghan social media goes wild. They look at President Zelensky in Ukraine as a hero, and they compare him to their own president, Ashraf Ghani, who left Afghanistan in a helicopter before the Taliban came to power, ran away, like many Afghans say, like a coward, with a suitcase full of money while Zelensky stayed to fight. These were memes made by Afghans. I shared them with my colleague in Ukraine. This is Timothy Milovanov, who you should all follow on social media. He is the president of the Kiev School of Economics. He's my former colleague at the University of Pittsburgh. He's a co-director of my center, and he was Zelensky's Minister of Economy. And he's an incredible scholar. Follow him. And so I shared this with Timothy. He put it on social media to show how people viewed these two leaders very differently, right? And so after the invasion of Ukraine, we saw these images come out of Ukraine. This, what you're seeing, is the kidnapping of a governor of Melitopol, who's the mayor of Melitopol, ethnic Russian. Okay, he's ethnic Russian, he's not ethnically Ukrainian. He was taken hostage by Russian troops. They put a sack over his head, you can see it here. He refused to cooperate. And here's Zelensky comparing the Russian troops to ISIS terrorists. Look how young he looks, how he's aged. So they say that this is a new stage of terror, and they're trying to eliminate these local government officials, okay? And so they demanded the release of the mayor, ethnic Russian, okay? You can read what they're being saying. So, you know, he's become like ISIS. He's comparing Russia, the Russian forces to ISIS. And so he called this a war crime. And this was huge, okay? So what happened in response to the kidnapping of these mayors? And there was a lot of them who were kidnapped, many were killed. Many of them were ethnic Russians, not ethnic Ukrainians. Remember, the Russian troops came into Ukraine to save the people of Ukraine, and then what you ended up seeing in many places, the Russians expected a warm welcome in eastern Ukraine, but instead in many places where ethnic Russians live, they experienced incredible pushback. And so this was really a shock, I think, for the Russian troops. And so you can see here, there are protests. This was very brave people in Melitopol protesting the kidnapping of their mayor, okay? And they're saying, free him. Remember how brutal the Russian troops were in those first early days of the occupation. This took a lot of courage to get out in the streets and to protest the Russians the way that they did. So I spent a lot of time thinking about these two dynamics, right? Why the Ukrainians seem to fight so hard against the Russians surprised many. Remember, everyone said the Russians said Kiev would fall in 3 days. All of the US military experts said the same thing, if you were watching the news. And Afghanistan seemed to collapse. So one of the issues I'm going to talk about is trust. Trust in government, how trust is made. And one of the things that we see in Ukraine prior to the invasion, prior to 2014, is there was not a lot of trust. You can see on this chart, not a lot of trust in general among the population and very low trust in the government. So why did people fight? So this is a question that keeps me up at night, trying to think about trust and legitimacy in states affected by conflict. Why are some resilient? Why are some not? What accounts for these differences? So one of the things that I really spend a lot of time thinking about in my work, I have a center, we're called the Center for Governance and Markets. We say that we explore the innovative ways people come together to solve problems. So I'm fascinated by the way people solve problems together, and a lot of our work at our center is based on empirical research on the ground. We are not content to sit behind our desks and talk about the world as we think it might be. We have to get out from behind our desks and go out into the world and understand it, and to be wrong. The willingness to be wrong, the willingness to say you don't know, and the willingness to learn is very, very crucial. And so one of the things that I've seen throughout my career as I've gone from conflict state to conflict state is this idea that the way that you build states is through a strong central government. And what I've noticed in so many countries is that decentralizing power to the local level actually, paradoxically, can build state strength. Normally when we think about, who knows who Weber is? Or Weber? Weber. Okay, what do we know about Weber? What is a state? How does Weber define a state? Come on, I have to have some poli-sci majors in here. I'm a political scientist. All right, Greg.
The monopoly on violence.
The monopoly on violence, that entity, the state, is the thing that holds the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence on a territory. So when you have something that has a monopoly on violence, that is the state. So when we think about building a strong state, we want something that can build that strong monopoly of violence. And so this means that a state should be strong, it should be centralized, especially when you're coming out of a conflict, when everything seems fragmented. The problem is, how do you get things under a central government? So I'm arguing here that decentralization might be a way, paradoxically, to strengthen central governments. We think that centralizing power is the way to go, but paradoxically, the hypothesis I'm working with here is if the central government's willing to give up some of its power to the regions, it may strengthen itself. But politicians rarely want to give up power. So decentralization, here's a very nice definition, where the central government cedes its power to subnational units. Over time, especially when the Soviet Union collapsed, it became a very popular policy recommendation for folks like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to make decentralized, decentralized, decentralized. These are not under conditions of conflict, however. And a lot of political scientists said, well, this decentralization effort led to a lot of corruption. Okay, so if you decentralize, then you're just taking corruption of the central government and bringing it down to the local level, which may be true. Okay. So there's a strong centralization bias, however, when we're dealing with post-conflict states. The idea is that centralization provides clear authority in decision-making, unity of command. The US military in Afghanistan loves centralized authority because unity of command. We need unity of command in our military. We're not going to deal with some fragments and some warlords. We need to deal with one central government. We're not going to deal with a bunch of folks at the local level. Too difficult. Unity, you need to build national unity after civil war, especially. These are all civil wars. So how do you build unity? Strong central government. So the idea is that decentralization fuels fragmentation, weakens the state. But so the question here is, does decentralization actually provide some kind of resilience? So that's what I'm going to argue here. There were some thinkers, and I'm a political scientist, so I'm going to give you just like in 2 slides, poli-sci 101 on this. That decentralization, some people thought was an antidote to conflict, but could unintentionally exacerbate conflict. Right? So you could incentivize weaker groups to continue fighting for more power if you have kind of decentralized systems. Some political scientists said the problem isn't decentralization itself, but when you have political parties that are based only on certain regions, and that is usually when political parties are based on certain ethnic groups that are regionally based, okay? And that tends to yield fragmentation. So there's tons of risks that decentralization brings, and you can see them all listed here. One of the biggest ones is empowering regional elites. Right, I've just come to power, I'm Hamid Karzai, I've just come to power after a long civil war. My big threat isn't, the states next door, it's all those other warlords I competed with for power. And so now that I'm in power, I've got to subdue all of them and get them under my control. We're going to talk about Syria in a second. Anybody following what's going on in Syria? Okay, I'm going to talk about Syria. So you can see, you've just come to power, you've had a long civil war, you've been shooting each other. The last thing you want to do is give your rivals power. No, you want to dominate. Okay. And feel free to interrupt me if you have questions. Yes?
Well, I was thinking decentralization is essentially what founding fathers did after the American Revolution, and they ended up with the compromise of limited government while still having the figurehead, the president, who still has some executive authority while still maintaining systems of balance, which most countries, I say majority of countries, don't. They usually either have a decentralized government or a centralized government. I don't think there is...
The United States is a huge exception.
Yeah.
And we can, I think the durability of the Constitution of the United States, right, is because it's unusual. It's institutional exceptionalism, yeah.
The big thing about that is part of the reason it happens a lot easier is due to the fact that everything is kind of already somewhat separate and regionalized.
Right.
Due to each little state had its own government.
Already had its own government, the way the colonies worked. Another reason we have a hard time, as academics especially, or people who watch what goes on in all these other countries, is because we have a bias in what we study. So if you go to a conflict zone, or if you're a scholar of international relations, you don't typically study local government structures in countries. You study, if you're studying post-conflict reconstruction, you look at what is USAID doing? What is the World Bank doing? What is the UN doing? And we study their different programs, and so there tends to be this bias in the research on reconstruction efforts that focus almost exclusively on what the international organizations do. And they tend to ignore what's happening in the local institutional settings. How is the local government performing? How is the bureaucracy performing? And why do people ignore that? Well, these are failed states. How can they have bureaucracies? It seems an anathema, right?
Yeah.
Why would we study bureaucracy in a failed state? What is there to study? Nothing. Zero. Tabula rasa. There's nothing there. So let's study how the international community builds these states. Let me just get to a few more points and I'll come back to you, okay? So a lot of people say that there's a huge danger to decentralization, especially this point by Will Klimka, which I think has defined modern thinking on this issue. Decentralization reinforces ethnic identities by formally acknowledging particular ethnic groups within a country, thus imbuing them with a sense of legitimacy. So if you decentralize, especially on an ethnic basis, you just reify national or ethnic identities and make it more difficult for a country to function. Or when you have this kind of decentralization under civil war, you allow new local governments or political parties to exist that can discriminate one another. And so what I'm arguing here is that when we look at decentralization in conflict zones, we really have to look at things very differently, and we have to take the political context into account. And I know I'm here with a bunch of economists in business school. I'm a political economist. Okay, so I study how the institutions and the rules affect outcomes, using the logic of economics and applying it to political settings. So I want us to take the politics of context seriously, that context matters, and we can all sit behind our desks and think we know something, but you go on the ground, you see something very different, and what you see often changes your mind. But it's important to understand that when you decentralize power, decentralization, forget about conflict zones in any context, may not be perfect. There's a lot of studies in any kind, in the United States, saying that decentralization sometimes leads to unequal levels of service delivery, right? There are equity concerns that people have with decentralization. There's corruption that could, exist with decentralization. I don't deny that this could be the case. But when we're looking at states affected by conflict, it's very important to understand and recognize that the biggest challenge these states face is trust and legitimacy. And this is more important than the efficiency of service delivery. And a lot of people go into states affected by conflict thinking, if we can just give people stuff and deliver them public goods and services and wells and paved roads, they'll really like the state. What I'm arguing here, that's not true. What people want, what people deserve, what people expect is to be respected and treated with dignity. Dignity. And sometimes that means doing a little less. So there are theories, public choice, and political economy, that tell us how this might work. And one of these is Elinor Ostrom. Have you ever come across Ostrom in your work? You will. You will. Elinor Ostrom was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics. And she said, she came up with a system called polycentrism. She described that a political unit has multiple centers of power, and these sometimes competing centers of power can lead to more legitimate systems. Polycentrism, decentralization is a form of polycentrism that allows experimentation. And in her definition, polycentrism means that there's overlapping, multi-tiered systems that can support each other, so that no one system dominates and no one system fails. So I'm taking her insights and thinking about something called polycentric decentralization and helping us rethink conventional wisdom in states affected by conflict, that these multiple overlapping centers of authority, rather than a single centralized power, might do more to build trust and resilience in states that have been deeply affected by violence. So I'm going to take you back to Ukraine. This is Ukraine in 2006. There was something called an Orange Revolution. There were all these colored revolutions that happened in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and there was one in Ukraine called the Orange Revolution. And a guy who ran for president in Ukraine, Yushchenko, very popular candidate, not very loved by Russia, handsome guy, was poisoned. You can see him in this photo. There was a revolution, you can see it here, that was opposing what had happened to him. People took to the streets, they opposed Russia's intervention in the elections. This was 20 years ago. He eventually became president. He didn't do so well, he wasn't very effective, and he was eventually replaced by this guy Yanukovych, who was very pro-Russian. You can see him hanging out with Putin. And this is the famous Museum of Corruption in Ukraine, which is Yanukovych's former home. Okay, it's now a museum of corruption. You can visit it in Ukraine and see the gold toilets. Okay? So Yanukovych was the president prior to Zelensky. And in 2014, he told the people of Ukraine that he wanted to move towards towards Russia in the Eurasian Economic Union, and wanted to move away from the European Union. Because a lot of Ukrainians wanted to join the EU. Ukrainians took to the streets. And this was called the Maidan uprising, the Maidan revolution, the Maidan movement in Ukraine. After 2014, the people of Ukraine said, this is it. We've been through this before. We had Yushchenko, we had the uprising, then we ended up with a pro-Russian president. This is our last chance to make a break with history. We have to take things into our own hands. We have to change the way government works. And what did they do? One of the first things that the Maidan movement did is made a move to decentralize power to regions. And I'll talk about this in a second. This is one of the famous leaders of the Maidan movement. His name is Mustafa Naim. He was from Afghanistan. But his family moved to Ukraine when he was small. And he and his siblings are very famous in the Ukrainian political landscape. And he lost an eye fighting Russia in this recent war. His brother was the Minister of Reconstruction in Ukraine, from Afghanistan. His family moved to Afghanistan as a child. Because remember, the Soviets were in Afghanistan. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. They ended up as refugees. So what did the Ukrainians do after 2014? They did a ton of reforms. And there were many NGOs, local, nonprofit organizations. One was headed by my colleague Timothy Milovanov, who I mentioned at the very beginning. He set up a nonprofit, a think tank called Vox Ukraine. He said, this is the last chance we have. We may not be able to deal with all the oligarchs and all of the corruption at the top, but we can certainly do something at the bottom. So they said, we're going to monitor every single reform that takes place. The Ukrainian government said, look, the people, through the Maidan movement, said we have to decentralize power, because if we decentralize power, it'll allow us to break from the past. It'll allow people in communities to finally have a voice. It'll change the way people see government. So in 2014, 2015, a massive decentralization program was put into place called the Hormata movement. And you can see in dark blue, these are the areas where communities chose, they self-amalgamated. These are the early decentralizers. And eventually, decentralization took over the entire country. And you can see the Hormata movement trainings taking place all over the country. And as a result of this, my colleague Timothy Brick, who is a sociologist in Kiev, has done a lot of research on trust and shows that decentralization in Ukraine after 2014 built enormous trust, especially in local governments. Why does it matter? Why does trust in local government matter? Yes?
Because if there's no trust, no one will want to participate in governmental structure.
Not only that, if you're facing an invading force from Russia, it's people in the communities that have to fight. And that's exactly what happened after in 2014. Remember those pictures I showed you of Melitopol? The mayor, ethnic Russian mayor, getting kidnapped. This decentralization reform created enormous trust at the local level, generated massive amounts of local revenue. People saw this revenue being reinvested into their communities, and finally people felt like something had changed in their lives. It didn't happen in Kiev, it happened in their communities. And so we wrote a piece together, Timothy and I wrote for Foreign Affairs. This piece on decentralization was a source of Ukraine's resilience to the Russian invasion. Decentralization helped the country fight the invading forces from Russia. Afghanistan, after 2001, maintained one of the most centralized government systems in the world. In one of the most politically decentralized societies in the world, the international community, the US government, together with Afghan authorities, implemented one of the most centralized political systems in the world. That led to massive distrust of the central government, huge amounts of corruption, and a feeling inside of many people that they expected a break with the past, but they didn't see one. They experienced enormous levels of corruption from police forces who were massively centralized, and other municipal services. In fact, what the United States did after 2001 is it rebuilt the old Soviet model of public administration that the Soviets built. The Americans came and said, there's nothing in Afghanistan, it's a tabula rasa. We have to come, we have to rebuild very quickly. Let's just rebuild what's there. What was there? The old Soviet institutions. The Americans didn't really understand that these came from the Soviets. They looked like they were from the Afghan monarchy. The Soviets had a huge influence in the Afghan monarchy. Anybody know who's in this picture? This is Nikita Khrushchev, 1955. After the death of Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev, who's the premier of the Soviet Union, visits Afghanistan, one of his first stops to spread Soviet internationalism. The Soviets began their influence in Afghanistan in the 1950s, and they built heavily centralized political institutions. Oops. Okay. This is in a society, most of my early work focused on the way Afghan villages govern themselves when there is no government. And in these communities, over years of field work, I've written several books on this, I found that communities in Afghanistan have very robust systems of self-governance because they have what you just described earlier, separation of powers. In every village, you'll find a village leader who's not a chief. He's a leader primus inter pares, first among equals. You have village councils and you have religious leaders. And what this does is leads to checks and balances that constrains the power of any one individual, which means that in communities, no one can call themselves a chief or a ruler. It means there's constraints, decentralized power in communities. And this, I found through survey data and through my own interviews over many years, is that when people had stronger local, customary, these are all traditional institutions, they actually had more trust in the central government. That's like the opposite of everything that we think to be true. When you have stronger traditional systems, you're going to have more support for the state. We think conventional wisdom suggests this is the opposite. We tend to think that there's a zero-sum relationship between these two. You have to weaken these local things in order to have stronger support for the state. I found that to be the opposite was true. Why? Because when these local authorities were stronger, people felt more confident in confronting the corruption of the central government. They felt more protected. They felt like they had people that they could go to. They had cover. So there was survey research done in Afghanistan towards the end of the US involvement in Afghanistan. I won't go through the 20 years of sorrow of the US involvement. I thought it was a huge missed opportunity, and I was yelling and screaming about it for about 15 years. I said, we have to decentralize authority. There were Afghan politicians arguing this. Many in the US, many in Europe, many at the fancy international financial institutions said, no, 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 centralization is the only way. Of course, every Afghan politician is going to say centralization is the only way, because no politician ever really wants to give up power. And so Afghans began to vote with their feet. They began leaving Afghanistan in the millions. In 2014, the Syrian civil war began. Afghans began posing as Syrians, going into Europe, because they knew that they could get out. So the survey asked Afghans, okay, I know you all want to leave, but what could make you stay? Now, we would think better jobs, better roads, better infrastructure. No, what did Afghans say? Number one, we want better security. Number two, we want to participate. We want to have a say. It's not economy, it's not governance, it's not infrastructure. We want to have a say in what goes on. Yes, we have a democracy, we elect a president, we elect a parliament. In Afghanistan after 2001, there was never a single election for a local government official. No mayors were elected, no city councils were elected, no governors were elected. All power was concentrated in the capital, so there was huge protests in the country over many years, protesting when governors were appointed by the central government, they'd be removed. The central government would put their friends from other parts of the country, from the south, put them into the north, and there would be protests. Here's a protest 2 weeks before the collapse of the republic, 2 weeks. A Pashtun, this is an ethnic group from southern Afghanistan, replaced a very popular Uzbek governor in northern Afghanistan, in an Uzbek part of the country. This led to massive street protests. We didn't hear about this in the United States. We didn't think about this as contributing to the legitimacy of the country, but people were upset. Afghans fought hard. More than 100,000 Afghans died after 2001. Civilians died. That was security forces, 100,000. Afghans didn't roll over and play dead. They died in the hundreds of thousands fighting for their country, and more than 70,000 civilians died. I saw no one protesting on my campus. By 2021, Afghans lost hope. They lost hope in that project of building a state. The Taliban went right to the local level. They said, we're going to have more local participation. We're going to have local courts. We're going to have local, local, local. That's all they screamed. That's how they won hearts and minds. Now I'm going to wrap this up by fast forwarding you through a few countries, because I know we don't have a lot of time left. Syria. How many have been following what's gone on in Syria?
A little bit. I don't know much, but I can
Okay, so Syria, we know that Syria is very ethnically divided. You can see a nice map here. You probably can't read it, but I mean, the map says it all, right? Syria is ethnically divided. Here we can see some of the estimates of who lives in Syria, majority Sunni population. That was led for many years by Bashar al-Assad, who came from the Alawite minority, that's in red, okay? The Alawite minority, so there's Kurds, there's Christians, there's Shia, but the Alawites ran the country for 50 years. Worst refugee crisis of our generation, the Syrian civil war, which began in 2011, led to more refugees here between 2011 and 2015. I talked about how Afghans pretended to be Syrians. Okay, so 4 million between 2011 and 2015 left because of that devastation as a result of the civil war. There was an uprising against Assad, and Assad ruthlessly killed millions of his own people. You can see the numbers continue to grow. Okay, there are Syrian refugees everywhere, and I would argue Syrian refugees in Europe, I think, triggered major populist backlashes. I think if there's a counterfactual, if the civil war in Syria never happened, would we be talking about the issue of immigration and migrants as much as we are? So there was this uprising, the civil war went on for many years, there was Al-Qaeda involved, ISIS involved, you named it, the Sunnis, right? Remember, the Alawites were a minority, and the Arab Sunnis then, you were on a border with Iraq, you started to get ISIS there, you got Al-Qaeda there, you got a real collection of extremists trying to fight Assad. Russia gets involved, it's really, really messy. And so there was this long civil war that really only ended in December of last year. Assad maintained a very centralized government. In fact, he was the Syrian government had its roots with the Soviets. It was an Arab socialist state, had a very strong centralized government. It marginalized all local and minority groups despite these huge differences. In December, has anybody seen this guy?
Isn't he the new?
He's the new president of Syria, Jolani, or al-Sharma. He's changed his name. And he's the president now of Syria. He comes from the Sunni population. He took control of the country, defeated the Assad forces, and this Sunni majority, which has long never ruled the country, is now in control. He had ties with Al-Qaeda, especially with ISIS in Syria. Okay, ISIS, and when he came to power last December, he says, "I'm done with ISIS. I'm going to put on a suit. Look at me." And so there's a lot of memes going around on the internet about Jolani and how he changes his outfit. The young Jolani bin Laden, this comes from Arabic. Well, these are memes, and these are people in Syria putting out these memes about Jolani. The cute Jolani, the athletic Jolani, the Fidel Castro Jolani. So he's now the president of Syria, and he's promising it's going to be different. I'm not going to associate with Al-Qaeda. He's trying to get all the foreign aid, right? He's trying to look legitimate, right? He's got a suit on here, right? He's the new Jolani. He's no longer, look at number 2 is how many of us remember him for years during the Syrian civil war. So when you've got a really fractionalized society like Syria, you would think, how would a leader like this put Syria together? What are they going to do differently? Syria was hyper centralized under Assad, and that hyper centralization, I think, triggered one of the bloodiest civil wars, if not the bloodiest civil war in the history of mankind. So what's happened? Oops. So this is what it looks like, territorial control. You can see Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, that's Jolani's group in the blue, but still the country is not unified. And what's happened recently, we're seeing ethnic minorities being killed.
Oh yeah, I remember. I heard about
This was last week. There was a major massacre of the Alawite minority. Remember the Alawites? Okay. Killed hundreds of them. Rumors of Christians have been killed in Syria. Alawites being killed. Okay? And so there seems to be real retribution of these groups. How do you stop the killing? So what I have argued is you have to change things up. You can't just go back and build a centralized system like you had. What does Jolani say? No federalism, no decentralization, unity of command. We need to rebuild the state. We got to fight this fragmentation. So he says no decentralization. He's ruled out federalism. He's ruled out decentralization from the get-go. But he says he's going to be different. No. When you say you're going to double down on centralization, in my mind, it leads to this. People have no hope, and it leads to retribution and control. So one of the most famous observers, Charles Lister, you should follow him. He's a really good analyst on Syria. Says, a weak decentralized Syria is a recipe for a return to crippling instability. Who benefits from that? This is conventional wisdom. We're having debates on Twitter with him. Decentralized Syria, I said decentralized. No, centralized. Centralization only leads to weakness. You have to centralize. It's idiotic, he says. Go ahead. Do what every leader has done before. Centralize power. I think the massacre of the Alawites illustrates how nobody will trust the system. So, has this worked anywhere? I'm telling you about a pipe dream. Okay, Ukraine, it helped. I think it helped mobilize people to fight against Russia, has allowed Ukraine to maintain legitimacy in the face of foreign invasion. That's a little different from the Civil War. Nepal. Anybody know anything about Nepal? Nepal had a brutal civil war for a very long time. You can see it's very ethnically divided. There's different ethnic groups, different castes. There was a peace agreement. We talked about restructuring the states. It took a long time to rebuild a new constitution in 2015 in Nepal. Established a federal system, decentralized power, allowed provinces and municipalities to use their local languages, allowed decentralization of services. This is a very poor country. But yet this decentralized system has kept Nepal out of conflict, and it has not returned to it. So I think that Nepal is a success story. Now some people will point to Nepal saying there's corruption. Oh, the public service delivery isn't so good, it could be better. Yes, but what does it have? It has trust. And trust is priceless. Trust you cannot buy. Trust you have to earn. Very interesting case I want you to all keep your eyes on in the coming weeks, months, and years, Myanmar. Anybody know anything about Myanmar? Longest war in history. They've been fighting a civil war since the 1950s. Huge refugees. Have you heard of the Rohingya? Rohingya minority, the Muslim minority, genocide of the Rohingya. They've ended up in Bangladesh. Myanmar is extremely divided. Many, many ethnic groups. Has never really been a peaceful state since the 1950s. There was a democratically elected government that wasn't performing very well, doubled down on centralization, was responsible for the Rohingya massacre. That led to a coup. 2021, military junta overturned the democratically elected government. It's not a happy story. There's still a civil war ongoing, but what's happened? The opposition forces fighting the central government have all come together in exile. We just hosted a major conference with many of the local government leaders in Pittsburgh last year in the fall. You can see this map of all these different groups, militant groups, who are now controlling massive parts of Myanmar. This is fascinating. They've come together to build a federal system in exile. They understand that the only way that Myanmar is going to break out of this vicious cycle of conflict is by decentralizing power. So they're coming together, writing constitutions, and deciding when they finally defeat the junta, And they're making huge progress, and I wouldn't be surprised in the next 6 months to see these groups take over the country. They understand they can't go back to the past. They have to change something. And that is the balance of power. So they're working on this now while they're fighting. And it is really amazing because in many parts of the country they've already set up local governments practicing what federalism might look like if they ever come to power. And this is a fascinating case of warring factions coming together in a polycentric way to build a new state that's decentralized. And they're doing this in exile before they've even won. Why? Because they know how high the stakes are. They know they cannot repeat the mistakes of the past. They know something has to change. And if one group like Jolani comes in and says, I have to be in control, the Sunnis have always been the minority, we're the majority of the population, but we have to rule the country under one fist. Because weak states will lead to fragmentation. They say, on the contrary, the fragmentation and the decentralization is a source of strength. And this is very counterintuitive to how we think about political power. I want you to think about this. It's extremely counterintuitive. When we go back to Weber's definition of what is a state, it is that thing that holds a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. Question, yes?
To go back far enough in history, things were very decentralized.
Yes.
So, what I'm saying is, yeah, decentralization happened before, it worked, then centralization suddenly happened.
Centralization, so, when states
So
happen,
it seems to be
centralization.
going in like a cycle somewhat, centralization and decentralization.
I don't think we're seeing a cycle.
Not like a cycle.
I think we're seeing a pretty strong trajectory towards centralization of states.
Yeah.
And I think as social scientists, when we think about what is a state, remember, Greg, what is a state? Remind us again.
That entity with the legitimate use or monopoly on violence.
Yeah, so Weber, Max Weber, famous German sociologist, he said, he's the guy who came up with the famous definition of a state. A state is that thing that has the monopoly and the legitimate use of violence. Monopoly meaning one control, one group, monopoly. How can a state have a monopoly in the situation of Myanmar, right? So you look at this map and you see all these different groups vying for control. You see the same thing. You see the same thing back in Syria. Different groups vying for control. You see these messy maps. You gotta have one color, one group controlling things. That's where people think a strong state looks like. And it may be the case that our models of what a state look like are wrong. And in fact, that heavily centralized model that's focused on a monopoly may actually lead to vicious cycles of conflict in many parts of the world. So I'm going to wrap up things very briefly. Trust is hard. Trust is hard to earn. A lot of countries during civil conflict learn to govern themselves with no central authority. This is what I found in Afghanistan. And in those years of civil conflict without centralized government control, people learn to do pretty remarkable things without the help of NGOs, international aid, or anyone. To us, those systems may look strange, backwards, second best, but in the eyes of many people, they are extremely legitimate and the only thing they trusted. And those things are hard to build, but easy to destroy. And oftentimes, the international community comes in with beautiful plans, with very short time horizons, and destroys things that worked for people. So when we think about building states after war, we need to think about the ways people govern themselves in their communities. Why is decentralization so powerful? Because it allows people to build on their local norms, their local values, the local institutions that they trust. And so when we think about states, I'll just give you my final spiel. Every state in the world has formal rules and informal rules. every state. So, anybody been to Ohio State? Anybody been to OSU campus? Okay. Have you been to the main quad? So the main quad of OSU, I should have put up a picture of this. They decided not to pave the walkways in the quad because they wanted to see where people walked. And so if you look at the picture of the OSU quad, it's not symmetrical. It looks really strange because they decided to let people walk and cross the quad and see where people walked and then pave on the path. See what I'm saying? That's what I'm saying. Go with the grain. Don't create the grain. So every society has the rule of law. Have any of you ever broken the law? How many of you jaywalked today? All right. So in every society, there's a gap between the rules on paper and the rules in practice, okay? United States, we have a gap. We're pretty good. Like, I would say like Sweden's probably here. Like, no one jaywalks in Sweden. When the gap becomes bigger, you get things like corruption, okay? And like, how bad is your corruption? When the gap gets really bad between the formal rules and the informal rules, that's where you get state failure. So when we think about how to rebuild states, typically we think that you have informal things here, warlords, traditions, customs, everything that people have been during wartime, and you have the state up here, which is pristine and perfect, right? So the idea is you got to get the messy stuff in here, push it up, and put some makeup on it, make it look real nice, but make it look more like the state. Okay? You want to change things around so the local really comes closer to the state. Reconfigure it. But what I'm arguing here is the solution to this dilemma, and I think we've been trying this, Afghanistan, Iraq, many countries after Civil War, trying to, Somalia, there's a whole category of them. Rather than pushing this, maybe we need to take the state and transform how we think about the state to make the state look a little bit more like society. And that's a very different way to think about how we rebuild things, rather than beautiful structures, hierarchy, uniformity. Maybe we'll have inefficiencies, but the question is, how do you rebuild trust? And as we go forward and think about these heartbreaking cases, full of people who really believe in a better future for their children, and I want you to forget that, is that there's no one perfect way. Every country is going to be different. Every country is going to produce its own path. But as we're thinking about these places, we have to think about those people, not at the top, but at the bottom, in their communities who are confronting violence, carnage, horror, but also incredible creativity. I think what we've seen in Ukraine is a model for the world, for us to think about aid, for us to think about decentralization, if we can think about what we can learn from that, because the Ukrainians broke every rule. They strengthened the center, built legitimacy, and built trust in the government before the Russian invasion, because the center gave up power. That's why Zelensky was so popular. Not because Kiev is so popular, but because communities are. But this is hard stuff. There's no one recipe, and I would encourage you in your futures and your careers to always ask questions, but to know there's no one recipe and there is no panacea. Thank you.